Hi, my name is Karissa Van Baulen, and today I'm going to go over the importance of user analytics and feedback within your documentation or knowledge base. A little bit about myself. I'm a digital nomad and have been for about a year and a half now. It's a little harder now with COVID. We are actually hunkered down for a bit now in Lisbon. I am a technical writer and knowledge base owner for an analytics and feedback company. Hint the talk. And I have been a knowledge base owner for about 2 years now. Because I work for an analytic and feedback company, at conferences, normally when we're allowed to see each other in person, there's a lot of talks during, in between chats and afterwards. And I always hear questions like, if you have 10 to 15 minutes a day, what would you monitor? What would you look at? What stats would you dig deeper into? What scores or sets of data are good or best for you? And during these conversations, I typically hear a lot of mention of self-service score and page views, which they can definitely do the trick. However, I personally have a really hard time with benchmarking scores like self-service score because historically I never felt like I got the insight that I was actually looking for. I always felt like it was just a number and I wasn't really getting any insight on how to improve the documentation I was creating. And so I like to get a lot of my context and understanding from the viewers of my documentation and from anyone who's going through it, maybe looking for help, if it's help documentation, or seeing how they really interact with it, which again, why I'm probably in the feedback game to begin with. And getting that information, there's so much potential for improvement just that stats alone cannot give you. And that potential is really most of the time untapped and not looked into. And so today I want you to go away making sure that you know how to tap into that information and get the really nice bits of insight that you haven't been getting before. The best question that I start with whenever I sit down to make a stats dashboard is, what do I want to know about my knowledge base? And a mistake I see a lot of people make is they want to get those stats out. So they make really fancy graphs right up front, or they make nice flow charts and really get into some tips, visual graphics. And they're just not supported by anything. So if we dig really deep and ask ourselves questions before we get started, we can make sure that we're getting stats that make sense and can actually be utilized for both ourselves and anyone within our company. And so the questions to start with would be, what do my users like? What do they dislike about my content? Is there anything that they need to be getting from the documentation that they're not? Why are they staying along the tick and submission funnel? And our job is interesting because when we talk about funnels, it isn't a typical e-commerce funnel where you're trying to get people to buy product and get to that conversion to the ending point. We're trying to do the negative. So we're trying to get people away from those conversions. And I will talk to you more about that in a bit. I also want to ask what part of my layout works and what just doesn't work. What's intuitive and what's not. And then, of course, we have our benchmarking scores. So this compares our documentation to similar documentation within our industry to see how it's performing industry-wide or any documentation-wide, essentially. And all of these different questions can be categorized under user feedback, drop-off points, visualized sessions, and self-service score. And so we're going to hunker into each of those categories. The first type of questions I want to touch on can be solved by user feedback. So again, user feedback allows you to ask questions like, why does a user dislike this page? What's confusing to them? One great thing about feedback, especially now while we mainly work remote, is that we don't need to be in person to get that feedback. So there's no need for a fancy in-person using testing or awkward conversations. It's just done within the view of that document. We can ask for this feedback in a bunch of different ways, like surveys, feedback, actual feedback widgets, questionnaires, email polls. There's a lot more, but I'll be focusing on surveys and feedback because these are the ones that I use most. Surveys and feedback can look different depending on what tool you use, but typically surveys will show themselves as pop-ups or full-page questionnaires that a user can respond to immediately or after the session, while feedback always lives within the page. So in this example, this is our survey within our documentation. And so this is triggered when someone says that an article wasn't helpful. And they click no, and a pop-up shows in a survey form that just says, hey, we're really sorry that you're not getting the information you need. What are you missing? What can we do to make it better? And once they fill that out, it also goes onto an email submission page where they can send our email to us. They can opt out. However, if they do opt in, we can use that email for further user testing, or we can use it to reach out to them to figure out what, really hone in on their comment and figure out why they were having that issue. Feedback, like I said, lives on the page all the time, and it's a permanent widget that's attached to somewhere in our site. So this is Vodafone, and the widget is attached to the right side of the page. So when they click on that, a little box pops up, and it has a scale to choose from. So it could be emojis, stars, whatever tool you use, whatever their buttons are. And so they can rate the experience on the site with those emojis, again, any button. And then it goes on to a comment, so they can leave a comment as well about why they're rating your site that way. And this is actually really great for documentation because you can pick up on really small issues like typos within your content that you wouldn't have saw normally, even with the review process. And this is actually a prime example. So I got this about 2 weeks ago from one of our sales team and our sales team staff, and she said, there's a big gap between questions and answers. Sorry, just spotted some others. And so in this case, our H or H2 and element and our paragraph element are just kind of weirdly spaced. And so this has gone through the review process. This has been published and ready to go. And it's just great. It's great to get that even third set of eyes, whereas your documents go through the review process, but there's some stuff that we wouldn't normally catch and that a viewer would catch that historically would just be pushed aside, like, oh look, they made a spelling mistake, or oh look, it looks really weird. Whereas with incoming feedback, now it's almost like outsourcing some extra bit of editing of, oh hey, that's messed up, you should go fix it. So we know what feedback can do for you, but how do we fit this into our data dashboard or give it a number? And my favorite way of doing this for feedback is approval rating. As a side note, the best part of designing your own dashboard is naming your own stats, essentially. So the thing with approval rating is we chose approval rating because it kind of tells the user automatically what we're gauging. And if we send it to marketing, or we send it to product, or we send it to anyone within the company, there's no need to explain that stat. They see approval rating and automatically they know what they're looking at. And so for this data point, we use page views, total positive responses on the page, and total negative responses on the page. And when I say responses, it could be either with a feedback widget, a survey, the actual responses from a ticket. So you can count positive and negative responses in the ticket. For our case, we used the "Did you like this page? Yes or no" button that I showed in the previous slide. And so the equation that we used, again, positive responses divided by the total number of responses, and that gave us our approval rating. And so you get this nice little percentage that we have an idea of how well our content is performing. So after it's calculated, you have your approval rating, and then you also have the total page views, like I mentioned. And in this case, we color-coded our approval rating. And so if it's like 100 to 70%, it's green, and we know, don't really need to look into it. It's great for now. And then we have anything below 70 to, I believe, about 50 or 45. We have this black color so that we know it doesn't really pop out to us, and we can just say, all right, you're there. We might need to look at you in a bit. Then we get to our yellow and red numbers. And so the first number is kind of like, hey, you probably should look at me. I'm important and need to get edited or just reviewed. And so what the page views do is it adds another layer of prioritization. And my yellow number is our most viewed page view, which means we really need to start looking into that. And once it gets to red, we really know we need to start looking into that. I also kind of noticed from this that our second highest page views documentation is in the medium range. And so I have my eye on that one. I know it's there. Probably going to look at it after this, to be honest. But it also gives you a sense of comfort, because I also know these are my top 7 viewed page in my approval rating. The bottom 7, I can see that they're all in good standing. So I know that I don't have to really focus my team's time and energy on editing those articles right now. But number two, they're going to have to spend some time on, I think. And what tools are available? So to use these type of feedback tools, there's a variety of different companies that provide these tools on a free or paid basis. Next, we have drop-off points, and drop-off points tie a lot in with user feedback, because once you see where your users are dropping off in the journey, or should be dropping off so that they don't contact your support team, those are the areas where you can pinpoint where to send feedback. We talked about this a bit earlier, where I said the documentation is a bit funny because our funnels aren't like normal e-commerce funnels. They are like negative funnels, where we're not pushing for that high conversion rate, so selling the most product. We're going for that lower conversion rate, so less people reaching out to our support team. And so you do this by identifying drop-off points and key areas where users are either successfully getting their information from our content or not getting the information that they need. Actually, one thing before I move to the next slide is that, yes, we want to be making the drop-off points as higher rather than lower. However, it's really important that when we focus in on drop-off points, we aren't compromising the content or user experience. And this is crucial because you can get a lot of false positives if, you start throwing up a random wall after your content so no one can reach out to your support. You'll see a huge drop-off point, but your users won't be getting the help they need, and it'll be creating a terrible user experience. So it's really important to keep in mind. Here we have a 4-step funnel. The first step, we have a user landing on any page of our documentation. The second step is landing on the contact form landing page. The third is filling out the ticket, and the fourth is submitting a ticket to our support team. And this is over a 7-day period. The box numbers, those are a red color, and those tell us when our drop-off points are higher. So the tool that we use is specifically for e-commerce. So it's bad for a number to be so high in an e-commerce sense, but in our sense, the higher the number, it has potential for being the areas where the content's helping the most. So if I see the first one, sorry. So if I see the first one, I see that the drop-off is 95.8%. And so I asked myself a few questions. Why are 970 people still going to the contact form? Why are the 20-odd thousand leaving? Are they getting the content they need? And so that tells me that in that particular space, we need to use feedback in any type of form, survey feedback, whatever we choose, so that we can ask those questions and get that insight. We can also go back to our handy dandy Google Analytics or standard stats so that we can see what our referral pages are. So where are they dropping off from, and the exact docs that they're leaving from. So if they view X doc, they leave. Rather, if they view Y doc, they stay and they try to reach out to us for a ticket. This creates our deflection rate, and it is a stat that all of us who have experience in support love, because the more tickets that are deflected, the less tickets that we have to do. And support the support team will thank you immensely if we can get this deflection rate up in a positive way. And so for this data point, we use page views on the target page, so the page where the drop-offs are happening, and page views of the referring page, so the page where the user is before they drop off. And this stat is very analytics heavy, but in reality, it's really important to talk about this in a feedback talk because you get more context from these numbers when you pair it with feedback. And the equation that we use is number of page views of the target page, so the page after the drop-off, divided by the number of pages of the referral page, so the page before the drop-off times 100, and that gives you a conversion rate. So again, normal funnel conversion rate is you want to get that high, but we want the deflection rate, so we subtract that from 100%. And I'm really sorry for people that don't like numbers, it's worth it, I promise. And for this tool, the deflection rate is equivalent to the drop-off rate. So any page, KB page, on average, has a 95.8% drop-off rate, which is deflection rate. That's what we're talking about. So deflection rate gives us an idea of how our pages are performing, but also helps with monetization of content, as well as tying in with the previous approval rating that we talked about. So what I did here was I added a column on the left side of page views and named it deflection rate. And so this adds an additional layer of prioritization so that we can compare the approval rating with the deflection rate and then see how it performs page views wise to really get an idea of how well or how necessary it is to look at a document. And this, if anything, increases my anxiety because number 2 definitely needs to be looked at. You can see that the rest of the ones that are in good standing, so the last 5, I believe, have a high deflection rate that's near average of what our overall documentation is. But that second one is 78% deflection rate, which means a lot of tickets are coming in, and the approval rating is kind of medium. So if I learned anything from this talk, that is the doc that we're doing immediately after this recording. The last bit of deflection I want to talk about is monetization of docs. And this is where deflection matters most to us as documentarians. And again, this is going to be a little number heavy, so prepare yourself. But it's kind of like if someone has a super, super specific hobby that they want to tell you about. If you really don't have personal interest in that hobby, it's really hard to fully understand where they're coming from. And the same applies to your stakeholders. So a lot of stakeholders aren't interested in this presentation. If they are, that's great, and you're very lucky. But it's hard to talk about something we're so passionate about that we know is super beneficial and get buy-in if they don't really understand where we're coming from. But money is something that everyone can understand, and the deflection stat helps with that. So example conversation, this is my stakeholder, and we want to get a resource to help us improve a specific doc. So I can tell her, all right, we have a document that has about 5,000 page views and has a 1.8% conversion rate. So this is the doc that we would be honing in on. Typically, it comes to about 90 tickets a month, and our support team spends about 40 euros a ticket. So if we are given these resources and can work on this document to really improve it, we will be saving the company about 3,600 euros per month. And with that statement, you have a really happy stakeholder. They're like, cool, let's do it. I understand money and this is great. And so the more you rationalize why you're working on something that isn't just a team and department goal, the more you can get funded, helped, looked after by different members of the team, and really be able to fund or spend time on those projects that you know are important to you and important for the company's success. Tools available for funnels. Again, there's a great range of tools for free or paid options. Moving on to the visualization of sessions. Typically, this used to be done in a setting where someone would get a room, give a group of people a list of tasks to complete. Everyone would be in a separate room that worked for the company, watching recordings, taking notes, a really long day. But being in a world now where we're moving more and more towards everything being digitalized, it's important that we still utilize user research without the crazy amount of time suck that it used to bring. And the two most common tools for user testing and visualization are recordings and heat maps. Both of these give you options to essentially witness a user session as if you were watching them there in the room in the least creepy way possible, and I will show you. So this is a recordings tool, and this tool will give you the most content. There are a variety of tools to use to get this information, but ultimately what you have is a recreation of what the user did on your page and how they interacted with your elements, your content, and what they ultimately did in the end. So you're able to see and follow them reading, and it's really interesting because you can see people reading with a mouse, and a lot of people don't realize that they're doing it, but when we read large bits of content, our mouse kind of drags along, so you even can see what part of your content is being read word by word, essentially. And these recordings work better than the traditional user testing in that this is the most natural environment for the user, so you're not giving them a defined set of tasks to use, and this is what they would typically do coming to your doc or coming to your knowledge base. Oops. Nope, not oops. So how do we pair this with traditional analytics? And the answer is you don't. I'm sure that there are ways to do this, but I find that the easiest thing to do is to hunker down with your team and create a watch and learn session. And so we do this every Monday, where it started as an optional call, and it's an hour long, and we would pick 2 topics, because you never want to do more than 2, because you really will not have enough time to do more than 2. So we picked 2 topics to look at if they were experiments or questions that we were having about our documentation. And we would use our filters within recordings to pinpoint those exact issues we wanted to watch. And we would sit down, we blocked an hour out, have tea, eat our breakfast sometimes, and just go through them, take notes, decide what changes we needed to make, maybe investigate even more into something we're seeing. And by the end of the call, an hour call, we typically have a full page of notes of things that we want to change. And this is done weekly. So these are weekly improvements that you can make to your documentation without having to do insane amount of research of just staring into your own docs and rereading things. This is your user literally showing you what to change. So I suggest, even if you do a half-hour session, you'll notice that, like I said, it was originally optional for us, and as we kept going, now everyone comes that's invited, and it's a really fun hour as well. So the tools available for this, again, variety, paid and free. The last thing I want to talk to you about is the self-service score, and self-service score is a benchmark that anyone in support will probably be familiar with, and it helps you get an understanding of your documentation and how users are actually able to get their answers, and if they're able to get their answers without reaching out for help. This is a benchmark score, like I mentioned. I know I mentioned benchmark before, so you're able to compare your documentation to other documents within your industry and create a goal for your team, as well as internal goals for the actual content you're creating. It's also really important to, when talking about self-service score with the rest of the company, sometimes it seems like when you say you want to improve self-service, that you're kind of saying, oh, we don't want people to reach out to support. And it has nothing to do with trying to lower those tickets, which is a benefit. But in reality, about 71% of users want their answers to be, or their questions to be answered without reaching out to support. They don't want to submit a support ticket. They don't want to use a chat widget. They want to be able to go to your content, read, find the answer, and bail. And so it's always really great to, whenever you mention self-service score, to always reiterate that you're trying to make the process faster for the user, not reduce the work and not keep that user in mind. So this is very user-centric thinking. So self-service score. Self-service score will tell us how likely someone is finding the answers without making a ticket. Is your content doing what it needs to be doing? how inclined for self-service our content is. So what is our layout like? Is it set up so that a user can just dive into the knowledge base, dive into our help center and find the answer they need? And do the users have tools for success? So is the training there? Are the docs that we have created cutting it? What are the users getting when they visit your content? Are they getting the answers, or are they just getting pain to have to reach out to support? And the equation we use is the number of sessions within the knowledge base in a whole divided by the number of tickets submitted, and that gives you your self-service score. And so this is our really, really ugly, and I'm very sorry, version of our self-service score. So we have it all into an Excel spreadsheet, and then we have it into a graph so that we can send this company-wide, and so that they have an understanding of how we performed in the previous quarters and now. And we also like to attach all the data points so that we can show the trend, because right now it's positive, so we want to show that positive trend line. And this is great because, yes, it's really ugly, but it gives you an idea of how to benchmark really quickly against yourselves as well as others in your industry. But like I said, I've had an issue with benchmarking in the past because it was great to be able to benchmark with others in my industry, but that was all it was doing. I was never getting insight from those numbers. I was never getting an understanding of why our number was so high or why it wasn't so high. And so I think it's really important when you do your self-service score to also make a cohort for yourself for growth. And what I mean by that is we have our self-service score number 1, which is our basic benchmark. So this is our basic equation. And now we can look at our self-service score and say, okay, others in our industry perform around 7.1 self-service score. So we're sorted. Cool. That's our benchmark. That's where we're at right now. And next we decided, okay, I can't really take any action from that in basic self-service score, but what if we look at the self-service score from people coming only from Google? So they come from Google directly to our knowledge base and then submit a ticket. And that self-service score is 39.5. And that's about a 5-point difference, but that's still a significant difference for us to look into that score and say, what is different about the experience for people that are just overall on our knowledge base, and those are specifically coming from Google. So then we have a whole set of experiments that we can run to figure out what's going on from Google and how we can improve the experience from Google. We also have one that comes directly from our tool, our company's tool, directly to the knowledge base, so that we can see how that varies. And that was actually even lower than Google. So this quarter and the next quarter, those are the 2 self-service scores we're focusing on how to fix those 2 self-service scores. Additional ones, like an example, would be if the self-service score, or what's the self-service score of an individual who went to more than one page? What's the self-service score of an individual who was on an individual article for more than 15 seconds? And the more integrated you have your Google Analytics, or if you use mixed panel segment, the more individualized you can get each of those self-service scores to really pinpoint what you want to work on. So even sections of your documentation. So my billing section, what's the self-service score of my billing section? And that's where I find the self-service score is most useful. I know a lot of information, but as a recap, I just want to go over a few of the points. User feedback helps with immediate insight as well as approval rating. So if you're not getting any type of user feedback, even if you don't want to create it into stats itself, definitely get in to start using user feedback. It'll give you the insight that you didn't know that you need. The drop-off point monitoring lets you know where to use your user feedback. Again, the drop-off point monitoring lets you see where you need that feedback the most. And it gives you so much insight along when you map a user's journey. So even if you don't use drop-off point, if you map the user's journey, you can then even see an idea of where that user feedback needs to be. Deflection rate can help with monetization of our work. Any project you're doing, if you need that funding or you need that feedback from different parts of your stakeholders and you want them to get invested, monetization of your docs, deflection rates there to help you. Session visualization, my glasses aren't working. Session visualization is user testing without the big budget. And so recordings are probably one of our favorite among our company, because we're able to really see what's happening on our content and really help the user have a better experience just by making changes from that content or from that recording that we're seeing. And last but not least, benchmark your content, but don't be afraid to set your own standards. Benchmarking is crucial so that we know where we stand as a team, as a content writing unit. But don't be afraid to improvise. Have your benchmark, set it to the side. Great, this is my benchmark. But make it more useful to you if you need to. Make changes so that you know what you can do to improve your content continuously. Thanks. I appreciate you listening. If you have any questions, definitely feel free to send me an email or message me on LinkedIn. I do have a list of these stats that I've mentioned written out, so if you prefer that in writing, definitely feel free to reach out.
First of all, I wanted to say thank you for your talk, because I think feedback is really important, but I also think, at least I've gotten caught in the trap of, where you're like, okay, I'll just throw up like a thumbs up, thumbs down on a page, but then there's no context to it. It's hard to really figure out how to communicate to stakeholders, where that context is. And I think you did a really great job at explaining all of that. So thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, no, the thumbs up and thumbs down buttons can be very disheartening. So, because a lot of people were saying in the chat it's true. Most people will put a thumbs down button because they're upset. They're not going to really give you some feedback a lot of the time if they're happy. So without that context, sometimes you're just like, oh man, I just spent all that time on that doc and now everyone hates it.
Okay, the first question's actually on the same lines, where I wanted to ask, what proportion do you think of negative feedback is linked to the fact that people don't like pop-ups, or maybe just don't want to deal with your pop-ups?
Yeah, I actually love that question. And right now we're kind of experimenting with how many, not pop-ups, but how many modules that we could show to help kind of further self-service before someone gets upset. And I will say before I start talking about it, it's really great to make sure that you have your community's trust. And that's sometimes hard to gauge. So you want to make sure that you're still letting them get to the contact us form. You're still letting them be able to get their answer, but let them know hey, you're in an experiment. We're just kind of testing stuff once you start talking to them. And then they're kind of like, oh, okay. We know you're not kind of being shady and trying to get us away. But yeah, it's a lot of the time we try to reduce it as much as possible. So we only want to show one poll or one feedback widget. And so a lot of tools will give you the option to show one at a time. But like I said, it really depends on the community or the people that you have to what they'll, I guess, put up with or what they think is acceptable for us trying to help them as much as possible.
Yeah, great. And then on a similar note of this, we had a lot of questions about dealing with negative feedback. And the next one is that people might be clicking no, they didn't find it helpful, they didn't like it, because of product expectations and not because of the documentation. Say your documentation is explaining the product, they're just upset with the product. So do you have any recommendations for how to filter out those stats or figure out those problems? I don't know.
So I come originally from a support background, and so we see this a lot with CSAT. So whenever someone's rating a support agent, they're just oh, I hate it because you didn't have this feature. Not the person was terrible. They could have been the most amazing support agent. And the same applies to documentation. So when we go through it, we kind of always put on our we rock hat, kind of really go in with a positive attitude, because you have to. And when we look at those stats of who's actually having a really bad time trying to get a hold of us and get their answer versus someone who's just saying, hey, you don't have this feature request. A lot of tools, we use Hotjar. And so with Hotjar, you're able to remove those from the overall stats. And so you want to be careful with removing stats in general, but it's kind of clean, it's kind of clean cut, where it's if someone's testing your tool and they give a sad face, it says, and their comment is test, you can remove that. If someone says, oh, you don't allow us, and it's a feed test, we can send it over to the product team But when we look at our overall stats, we can make sure that that's not included for our set of confidence in our documentation.
Oh, that's great. And I love that I went on a whole thing about this yesterday. Like, I love that you come from a support background. I think it's just so interesting, all these different intersections that we can learn about documentation from these different departments. And then we had a couple questions about, like, how would you maybe suggest implementing something like this if you're a lone writer? A lot of us are, sitting on teams and we're the only technical writers. And it sounds like it was a team effort for you. So I don't know. What would you think?
So I saw this question and I was like, yes, please. Like, I was a lone writer for a very, very long time. And it took a lot of work and buy-in from our stakeholders within the company to try to get people to start helping me, kind of just like, hey, come over. But when I was by myself, I really relied on Google Analytics and a Hotjar, essentially. And I didn't mention it through the talk that I do work for Hotjar, so this is just so everyone knows. So I relied mainly on Hotjar and making sure that I constantly had those stats running. And when it comes to stats and you're alone, it's really easy to be overwhelmed because you don't know where to start. And so what I did was I just threw the whole net out. I was like, okay, I'm going to start collecting feedback. I'm going to start doing, and then I was able to kind of gauge again with like, okay, maybe that's a little overwhelming. Let's pull that back. Or maybe I don't need to have like 10 pull, like just kind of adjusting. But the bigger net you cast, and if you go in with it as a lone writer saying, okay, this might be too much, but I can always pull back. It's really useful because you still get all those stats that you need. And then the second part is managing how to go through those stats. But I think we're going to be talking about this in the Lone Writer Slack channel in a bit. So definitely, if you have more questions about that, come there and we can talk about it.
Sounds good. And then really quickly, I'm wondering, like, where do you get stats? Like, how do you get stats for comparing industry-wide comparisons or benchmarks, or do you not? Like, how do you put that into context as far as like other people's performance in docs?
We really struggle with it sometimes because we can rely on our knowledge base is based in Zendesk, and so we can rely on some of Zendesk stats. But at the same time, knowledge bases as a whole, research and stats are very limited. Like for some reason, I feel like it's a thriving part of our industry, but like a lot of people just don't do that research. So I rely on Zendesk. I rely on TSIA. They do a lot of research solely on knowledge base as part of their whole organization. But a lot of it is reaching out to the community as well. So I'll use support-driven Slack, I'll use Write the Docs Slack, and I'll kind of get an idea of, okay, what industry do you work in? And, what does your knowledge base look like? And that way we can kind of gauge, because it's really difficult because right now, as you said, like our self-service score is about 38 or 39, and the industry standard is about 7. So that's, to us, you're like, oh yeah, that's great. But it leaves that room of, okay, well, how do we improve? We know we can improve. Trust us, we can improve. Like there's tons of stuff we need to work on, but it's just like, what do we work on if we're already that high above like the benchmark? And so it's really important to get the community involved and reach out to people. And I've been reaching out to people for about 3 years now. And some people are super busy and they can't do it, and that's totally fine. But it's insane the amount of people that are willing to be like, let's talk, let's do it, and just like go do calls, email threads, Slack threads. And that's the easiest way for us to kind of gauge ourselves within the industry and outside of the industry.
Absolutely. It makes total sense. And then we are unfortunately out of time, but where can people, we have still so many questions. Is there a way that people can still get in touch with you?
Yeah, of course. So my email is karissa@hotjar.com. I also feel free to reach out to me on the Slack. We can do a DM. I might do an unconference today as well, because there's a lot of questions. But I also will be doing a one-pager. I saw a few people ask that kind of goes over all the tools that can do what I suggested, as well as the basic stats that I had in that slide. So if you are interested, feel free to email me and I can send that one pager
people
over
seem
to you.
Really excited about a one-pager and potentially an unconference, but no pressure. All right. Thank you so much, Karissa, for being with us today. I really appreciate it.